have the pleasure now of introducing to you Jonathan Cole. Jonathan Cole is a graduate of the University of Connecticut in 1979 with a Bachelor of Science in Civil Engineering. He is a professional engineer licensed in New Hampshire, Connecticut, and Florida with 28 years of experience. For more than 10 years, he has been the head of a mid-sized engineering firm with some 25 employees. And in addition to designing large-scale engineering projects, he has performed services as an expert witness in his field. Jonathan Cole tells us that he became aware of problems with the official story about the events of September 1st, 2001 in late 2007. And being an engineer and a man of scientific disposition, he set about first researching the scientific papers and then conducting experiments to either confirm or eliminate various hypotheses. His experiments include verification of David Chandler's analysis of downward motion of World Trade Center 7, steel corrosion analyses, and experiments with thermite. Jonathan Cole is a director of the Board of Architects and Engineers for 9/11 Truth, and his experiments have been made available in, I think, very persuasive video form. His tests, which really apply the criteria of scientific method to hypotheses built into the official narrative and to the counter-hypothesis that, for example, variant forms of thermite were used in the destruction of the World Trade Center towers. Jonathan Cole's presentation is entitled "The Official Collapse Narrative and the Experimental Method." Jonathan.
Well, good afternoon. It's a pleasure to be here. I can tell you that. It's great up here in Toronto. I've never been here before. So how did the Twin Towers fall? How did the Twin Towers fall? It sounds like a very easy question, but in fact it's kind of a tough question, because if you ask almost anybody on the street, if you had asked me 4 years ago, I would have said, oh, the planes hit and fires, and I think I heard some about explosions, but that didn't happen, and then they just fell down. But I really didn't understand how those towers fell. And I think if you ask the average person on the street that same question, they won't really clearly understand the official story of how those towers fell. But knowing how those towers fell is critical, because it's like if somebody was murdered, if they were murdered, that's one thing. If they died of natural causes, it's another. We need to understand how those towers fall before we can go find out who did it. And so it's a critical question. And as pointed out earlier by Graham McQueen, it's not only asking how they fell, the answer really depends on when you ask that question, because how those towers fell morphed over time. The very first day of the event, as Graham McQueen pointed out earlier, everybody knew, or a lot of people knew, it was obvious that there were explosions there. We heard it over and over, and we heard it that first day. So the official story from the media that very first day was that there were secondary explosions that helped bring those towers down. Graham McQueen earlier today had some firefighters. I think they were conspiracy theorist firefighters. They heard explosions. I'm going to show you some of the media's take on it, and also some of the civilians' take of that day as far as what they heard. Hopefully this will work.
Actually, devices that were planted in the building. There was another explosion that took... Huge explosion that we all heard. An explosion. Explosion.
And another explosion.
Explosion, a lot of explosions. Of the explosion. Explosion.
We presume because of the initial explosion there may have been secondary explosions as well that were detonated in the building by these terrorists.
The entire building has just collapsed, as if a demolition team set off. When you see the old demolitions of these old buildings, it folded down on itself, and it is not there anymore.
If you wish to bring anybody who's ever watched a building being demolished on purpose knows that if you're going to do this, you have to get at the under infrastructure of a building and bring it down.
We have an enormous explosion now in the remaining World Trade Center. It happened the same way. The explosion started high in the building and worked its way down. There you see the building imploding. Do you see what's happening? I think we're safe. Here I think I'm on safe ground, Bill. I don't think this was clearly the way the structure is collapsing. This was the result of something that was planned. This is not, it's not accidental that the first tower just happened to collapse and then the second tower just happened to collapse in exactly the same way. How they accomplished this, we don't know. But clearly this is what they wanted to accomplish.
It was obvious. It was clear what happened to those buildings on that very first day. But interestingly enough, the very next day, there was very little mention of the explosive theory, the explosive demolition theory. The next day when I got up, I got the newspaper. Being an engineer, I was kind of interested in it. And we were told something completely different. There was nothing in there about those explosions. September 12th, my local hometown paper carried a story from the the Washington Post. And in it, they already knew what happened. Pretty amazing. We have the two largest structural failures in history, and they already had it solved. They knew what caused it to come down. And we were told a different story. We were told the melting steel story. It says in just under an hour, a raging fire from burning aviation gasoline softened or perhaps melted the steel. The experts already knew. The experts agreed that collapse of the two towers after the attack was almost inevitable, as if obviously they're going to fall down. And they give little diagrams in there as far as how they came down. Newsweek extra edition. The intense fire caused the tower to collapse. It melted the structural steel. What the firemen might not have realized is that gushing jet fuel was melting the steel. As if firemen don't understand that steel frame structures, they routinely rush into them because they know they don't collapse. It's never happened before. But the Newsweek experts explained to us that the firemen probably didn't realize that. Later on in April, news media, the PBS documentary, Nova, PBS, Nova, respected Nova. As the steel began to soften and melt, the interior core columns began to give. And indeed, there was ample evidence of melted steel. They were right about that. There's no question that there was melted steel. Here's some right here. And later you'll learn of other evidence of melted steel in very high temperatures. But the problem soon developed, actually it wasn't that soon, in the next, like I say, in the next half a year or so, the problem came up that office fires and jet fuel cannot melt steel. It's a physical impossibility. They just cannot get hot enough to melt steel. And yet, we know there was steel that was melted. So that was a problem with our official story. Nova put together, and they explained the official story. I mean, after all, where do we get the official story from? We get it from the media because nobody's going to read all the documents that are out there. So the average person gets it from the media. Nova put together a very nice documentary that I remember watching. And it's interesting in their documentaries that they tend to use animations rather than the actual collapse itself. They don't focus on the collapse, they use animations. As you watch this, notice that they will show the trusses collapsing, and they'll show those trusses breaking away, but they don't show the concrete floor on top of it. The concrete floor is invisible. So we have an invisible floor and these independent trusses breaking down. Also notice in this clip that we'll have entire parallel floors going down, but they're basically floating floors in space. There's no corners on them, and they show this pancaking down. And so then we got into this pancake, what we call the truss failure theory for the official story.
The heat of the fire would have softened both the floor trusses and the outer columns they were attached to. When the steel became weak, the trusses would have collapsed. And without the trusses to keep them rigidly in place, the columns would have bent outward and then failed. Once the trusses fail, the floors they were holding cascade down with a force too great to be withstood. The result is what's called a progressive collapse, as each floor pancakes down onto the one below.
Now, what do we notice left standing? They forgot to keep going, and there's something left standing. This is a strong core, 47 columns. They weren't just freestanding spaghettis. They were all interlaced and tied together. It was, in essence, a freestanding structure. They forgot to tell us in the official story how that came down. Now, along with experiments, hypotheses that are given ought to match or ought to explain the phenomenon which we observe. So what did we observe? Did we observe those floating pancake floors coming down? Did we observe any pancakes at all at ground zero? This is a collapse in New Zealand from the earthquake, unfortunately. And what do we have here? What do we see? We see pancakes. We see large chunks of floors. This was a 6 or 7 story building that came down. What did we see at ground zero? We had 110 floors. Did we see one complete floor? How about the roof? Did we see the roof? There was no load on top of the roof. We see nothing. We see cut steel, all cut up steel, but no 1 acre size floors. So again, we need to observe, and what do we use? We use our eyes to observe what actually happened versus the animations. Now, what about if we look at the actual collapse of the North Tower? Do we see entire floors coming down and hitting, or do we see partial floors? What do we actually see? This is just with a sound off, same speed, and I'm going to slow it down here. What do we see? We see them racing down one side. We see the corner still standing, coming down one side only. We don't see entire floors impacting. We see partial floors. What about this corner? Why is that still standing when this is rushed way ahead, dozens of floors ahead? Quite unusual. It doesn't match. It doesn't match what we were told. Well, then there were other theories that came out. Scientific papers. How about the scientific papers that came out? Earlier today it was mentioned about Professor Bazant. Professor Bazant put out some technical papers. He put one out shortly after 9/11 explaining to us how these buildings came down. And it didn't talk about the pancake theory. He also made subsequent papers over the years. They evolved into. And he basically had this theory that we like to call the crush down, crush up theory. And again, it was mentioned earlier. And indeed, it's a beautiful paper. It's filled with very nice equations. Frankly, some of the equations I don't understand. It's very, very nice paper. And I have no doubt Professor Bazant is an extremely intelligent man, far more intelligent than I am. And in that paper, he basically describes that rather than a pancake collapse, it was almost like a sledgehammer or a pile driver collapse, where we have the weakened floors here, okay, as the heat builds up. This upper top block, it's a smaller top block than the rest of it. It's undamaged down here. And this drives this all the way down until it gets down to the bottom, crushing all this. And then this crushes itself up. So we call it the crush down, crush up theory. Does that observe? Do we see, using our observation, our power of observation that every one of us has, we should be able to see that top block. And we should have most of the mass coming over that portion of the building. Do we see that? What do we see there? Do we ever see a top block in any video or any picture whatsoever after the first few seconds? Is most of the mass over the central core column, or is a lot of the mass blown outside that? Everything that's outside there cannot. It is impossible for it to impact the undamaged structure below. Where is that top block? Well, some may say, well, maybe it's hidden behind there. There's a corner sticking up there, by the way, but maybe that top block's kind of hidden behind there somehow. Well, Richard Feynman, Nobel physicist. He was known as the father of quantum electrodynamics. Please don't ask me any questions about that. I can't even spell that, let alone know what that is. He was a theoretical physicist and extremely intelligent. He knew, even being a theoretical physicist, that experiment is the key. It's the absolute key to verifying any experimental analysis, I mean, any theoretical analysis that may be out there. And this is a quote, it's very close to what he said there, and you can get it on video on YouTube, it's out there. And he basically says, it doesn't matter how beautiful your theory is or how smart you are. If it doesn't agree with experiment, it's wrong, because we're trying to emulate what really happens in nature, despite all the analysis in the world. If it doesn't match experiment, it's wrong. Because experiment, unlike NIST, experiment is consistent with physical principles. Okay, it always is consistent with physical principles. It is nature itself. So one of my earlier videos, I've done several videos, I'm only going to touch on 3 here. One of my earlier videos was just to see if Professor Bazant's concept of a crush down, crush up matches experiment. Now in these videos, I use basic, simple, frankly, I use concrete blocks. Now I know that I'm not modeling the actual collapse of the Twin Towers. What I'm trying to demonstrate is a fundamental law or a property, not necessarily trying to model the towers. I am never trying to model the towers. It's sort of like saying a campfire gives off about the same heat as a forest fire. We're looking at the principles of the heat that come out, but not actually modeling the tower. So please understand that when you see that. So this is just a clip from one of my videos, one of my first ones about the crush down, crush up theory. A month after this, Professor Bazant and others published a paper that explained how the towers fell, even though NIST could not explain it after years of study. Their paper described how the upper smaller blocks of floor crushed down the larger undamaged structure below down to the ground, and then the upper block crushed itself up. Not only was no upper block observed impacting the lower sections, but why the spire was not crushed as the upper block fell remained unexplained. And Newton's third law tells us that interactions between colliding objects are always equal and opposite, meaning that any upper smaller block of floors would have also destroyed itself when impacting a larger structure below, well before it could have crushed all the way down to the ground. And no experiment has ever demonstrated this remarkable crush-down, crush-up concept endorsed by NIST. The theory of a smaller top block crushing down a stronger, larger, lower structure of similar material is impossible. As far as I know, it's impossible, again, because we have a law, Newton's third law, it's not a theory, that, again, opposing forces are going to crush each one. And especially remember that that upper smaller block of the towers was actually a little bit smaller than the rest of the towers. So we have a smaller block trying to crush a larger block. What about the official studies? Okay, again, okay, so since no experiment has confirmed this crush down, crush up, maybe somebody out there can do it. I can't do it. And just the opposite has been demonstrated. That theory is wrong because it does not match experiment. Okay, what about the official reports? Well, shortly after 9/11, FEMA, Federal Emergency Management Agency, and the American Society of Civil Engineers, they went into ground zero, and they did a report, and it came out in, I believe, May of 2002. They studied it for 6 months, and they proposed a theory. It wasn't a pile driving theory. They proposed very similar to the PBS NOVA, the expanding floor truss failure theory. And that theory relies on, there's heat in the buildings. Here's the core columns, and here's the perimeter columns. That heat expands the truss, it bows those trusses outward, and the trusses actually fail at the connection. So here's the columns, here's the trusses coming in there. Those trusses break, okay? They break and they smash down, and then they kind of pancake down the rest of the way. That was their theory. It's in a published book. As far as that was what the official story was at that time. Well, then the National Institute of Standards and Technology, NIST, came along, and they studied it from about September of 2002, I think all the way to about fall of 2005. And they came out with a totally different story. They said that they disagreed with the FEMA initiation sequence, what we call the initiation of how it started. They said that those floor trusses did not expand and pull, and the connections did not break. They said just the opposite of FEMA. So our official story is changing a little bit. They basically said that we know, obviously, airplanes hit the towers. We all agree on that. Knocked off the insulation. The jet fuel fire started. They said the fires weakened the floor truss, but the steel did not melt. The floor trusses sagged, but the connections did not fail. And that sagging pulled in, it didn't push out, those perimeter columns, and then once the upper section began to move downwards, global collapse ensued. So that's their story. That is the latest official story. But even after all that time, money, and expertise, NIST said that they were unable to provide a full explanation of the total collapse. In other words, NIST sidestepped a whole bunch of evidence out there. This is evidence that they never had to address. Now that evidence, why did the roof accelerate down with no jolts? Why did we see squibs? Where did that upper block go? What caused all that concrete to turn to powder? What cut those core columns, and why did they fall last? Why did they fall last and not first? All those things they could sidestep, as well as a whole bunch of other information out there that I'll touch on that they never had to touch because they stopped at collapse initiation. They never had to address it. So after all these years, what is the official story? Well, again, it depends on when you ask the question. The steel melted, the steel didn't melt. The trusses pushed on the columns, the trusses pulled on the columns. The truss connections broke, the truss connections held firm. The crush down, crush up theory, the truss failure pancake theory. And then we have the column failure pile driver theory. So it's no wonder that the average person really doesn't have clear in their mind how those towers fell. And after all those years of studies, thousands of pages, millions of dollars by the best of experts, we really don't even have the full collapse narrative. It doesn't exist. We only have the official collapse initiation narrative because they just went to initiation. But the missing element of every single one of those theories is confirmation by observation and experimentation. Theories or models must describe what we observe. Confirmation of those theories by experimentation or testing is the cornerstone of the scientific method. And the scientific method was touched on yesterday by Richard Gage, but it is the key is experimentation. The strongest arguments prove nothing so long as the conclusions are not verified by experiment. Again, the final NIST tower report did not actually involve the structural behavior of those towers after the conditions for collapse initiation were reached and collapse became inevitable. And experts agreed that the collapse of the two towers after the attack was almost inevitable. They told us a few days after. But NIST is saying it was inevitable. Inevitable means no matter how many times I drop my pencil, it will always hit the floor. It's inevitable. But is collapse inevitable? They also said that the downward movement of the structural block was more than the damaged structure could resist, and global collapse began. Now, NIST uses some pretty clever words, as well as other folks out there. They use some clever words, and you have to think about it, what they're saying here. It was more than the damaged structure could resist, and global collapse began. But what about the undamaged structure below? What was it more than that could resist? Imagine, if you will, that your arm is the Twin Towers, okay? And here's this upper block, and here's where the plane hit, okay? This is all weakened here. But this is strong. And like my arm, and like your arm, the towers structurally are tapered. Visually they're not. They look perfectly square, but structurally they're tapered because the lower portion of that steel is much, much thicker than the upper portion. So it gets stronger as it goes down. Any segment as we go down gets stronger and stronger. That lower structure, here's people escaping from it. It was not significantly damaged. It was still strong. It could hold not only all the people, but it could hold overloads from wind loads and other loads on that. We know it was strong. So will global collapse ensue once started, and is collapse really inevitable? That's what they're telling us. Let's look at some real-world examples of other buildings that were intentionally weakened. In this case, they were controlled demolitions. And they were weakened at the lower part of the structure, so it has even more mass to come down. Once they're weakened, will they automatically come down? This is called a zip feed grain elevator. It was weakened, it didn't go down. It is not inevitable once you start something. Notice that it decelerates, it does not accelerate, it decelerates. Here's another one. We're blowing up the lower section. Will it keep going? It decelerates, it slows down, it doesn't accelerate. It is not inevitable, necessarily. There's another one. What do we observe? It is not inevitable. It's falling over, again, as Richard Gage would say, to its path of least resistance. So the statement that global collapse is inevitable, and all these experts are saying that, well, of course it's going to happen, is not backed up by our own observations. The next experiment I did had to do with what we call eutectic steel. Well, what is eutectic? I had never heard of it before either, by the way. Let me give you an example of a eutectic. A eutectic, first of all, sort of by definition, is an alloy or mixture that has a lower melting point than either of the two elements. As an example, ethylene glycol, you know it as antifreeze, it's in your car, okay? We know that water freezes at 0 degrees Celsius or 32 degrees Fahrenheit. Water will freeze. Ethylene glycol, pure ethylene glycol, will freeze at around minus 10 degrees, okay? So we have 100% ethylene glycol, minus 10. Water, 32. But as we mix those and put them together, and as we change those percentages that are in there, the freezing point, or the, I'm sorry, the melting point, or the freezing point drops way down. It goes down to about minus 50. So you don't want to put pure antifreeze in your car because it won't be as good as when you add water. It's a similar, it's a sort of a eutectic. When you add something to it, it lowers the melting point. Now with that said, whoops, I went the wrong way, sorry about that. With that said, some professors, Professor Jonathan Barnett from Worcester Poly Institute went out to ground zero. Jonathan Barnett is an expert, fire expert. He's seen a lot of buildings come down by fire. He's an expert, and he truly is. And he noticed something there. He noticed some very unusual pieces of steel. Being a fire expert, going to a lot of sites, he thought, here's a piece right here. It's very unusual. And it looked like Swiss cheese, and it was full of holes, and it was melted, had intergranular melting. And so they analyzed that, and they tried to figure out what was in there. And the answer was there was a eutectic on it that had elements of sulfur, okay? Sulfur was on it. So the big question was, where did the sulfur come from? He had never seen that before in a normal office fire. And so different people put their theories together. One of them was put together by Professor Frank Greening. He put together a long paper to explain how that eutectic could form out there. It's called Sulfur in the World Trade Center Disaster. And in his paper, it's several pages long, I believe he's a chemist, he said he concluded that the sulfur emissions were relatively small compared to those involving diesel fuel and CaSO4, which is calcium sulfate, in gypsum wallboard. Sulfur emissions from the thermite or thermate are shown to be quite small, because at that time people were starting to say, well, I wonder if there's some thermitic material in this thing called thermate. And he was discounting. He said, no, the thermate is quite small, but probably some gypsum board. He did leave a little wiggle room at the end of his paper. He said, by way of verifying these conclusions, NIST fire tests should be repeated using shredded aluminum, crushed concrete, gypsum, water, rusted steel, aviation fuel, and plastics. In other words, he was saying, maybe we should do an experiment to see if my calculations are right. I'm not sure, it's a relatively easy experiment. I'm not sure why I didn't do that first before writing the paper, because as we'll soon see that it doesn't exactly fit. Now, the mainstream, again, where we get our information from, the corporate media, they give us the information. They were more bold. They told us in no uncertain terms that the claims from the mysterious melted steel has been unraveled. They solved it. The sulfur came from masses of gypsum wallboard. Gypsum. You're surrounded by gypsum. Gypsum wallboard's all around you. Gypsum is routinely used as a fire protectant. It's around these two columns here to protect those columns, which I believe are steel. Okay? It's a fire block. Why would people use a fire block routinely for 50 years and plus if it was going to have some impact on that steel and melt it? Doesn't make much sense to me. It'd be like saying, here's some car wax, but it's got battery acid in it. It just, to me, it doesn't make sense. But this is what we were told in no uncertain terms. It was the gypsum. Some unique steel that was razor sharp and looked like Swiss cheese was found at ground zero. Firewise professors found eutectic formations, a phenomenon never before observed in building fires.
It was a surprise to me because it was so eroded and deformed, and so we took it for analysis in the lab.
When we did the analysis, we actually identified it as a liquid containing iron, sulfur, and oxygen,
which is the same materials found in thermate and causes similar eutectic formations. And even though the New York Times described this as perhaps the deepest mystery uncovered in the investigation, NIST never solved where the sulfur came from. Yet the media experts claimed they were able to unravel the mystery.
The claims of the mysterious melted steel from Tower 7 has been unraveled.
And they also said they found the source of the sulfur.
The sulfur came from masses of gypsum wallboard that was pulverized and burnt in the fires.
Even though gypsum is routinely used as fireproofing around steel, NIST and the media experts never conducted any experiments to back up their claim. But when gypsum and building material was packed around a steel beam and burned at similar temperatures for long durations, nothing of the sort happened. What I basically did there, I found a piece of steel and I took a bunch of gypsum board and I wanted to really pack it in there. Some of it I soaked in rainwater because one of the early guesses as far as where the sulfur came from was from rainwater or acid rain. So I soaked part of it in rainwater, and I did put diesel fuel in there. I did put some parts of an airplane in there, and I put concrete in there. And I let it burn for a couple days. I had a lot of material there. I just kept feeding it with my loader. I kept feeding on more and more brush. You can see the entire video. It's in your packet that I did give to the panel. It's called the Mysterious Eutectic Steel. And the point of it was to prove whether it was possible to get eutectic formations on steel. Can you create sulfur from all the gypsum? My experiment could not do that. Maybe others out there can, but my experiment so far could not prove that that's where the sulfur came from. Now, after this experiment, Dr. Greening did email, and he did say, I'm prepared to admit that my initial proposal of how the steel was sulfided during the 9/11 events needs to be modified. Certainly, it looks like diesel fuel, gypsum, concrete, and aluminum alone are not going to do it. And he goes on to suggest some other things, but he's acknowledging that all that work that he did on that paper, it most likely will not cause those eutectic formations. Nevertheless, there's a lot of information still coming out today. Not letting the experimental results or this admission by Dr. Greening himself get in the way, this gypsum wallboard theory for where the sulfur came from is still being used today. Just last month, the Skeptical Inquirer, article by Dave Thomas, says, truthers claim that a few pieces of sulfidized eutectic steel found in the towers proves thermite with sulfur usage. But this occurred, he's telling us, this occurred because the sulfur released from burned drywall corroded the steel as it stewed in the pile for weeks. Maybe he can provide an experiment to prove that, but Dr. Greening acknowledges that it's probably not true, and my experiment does not confirm that analysis. But they're still using it today. Okay, what about thermate? What about thermate? Can thermitic material cut or melt steel? First of all, what is thermate or thermite or thermitic material? I had never heard of thermite before 3 years ago, ever. Thermite is a mixture of iron oxide and aluminum. And when you add sulfur to it, they call it thermate. It's got that sulfur right in it. And so I decided to do a little research on thermite and to find out what it could or could not do. Now, one of the things that was found in the dust, which is going to be talked about later at length by Niels Harriet and Kevin, is that there were small iron microspheres found in the dust. These are very small spheres, and they're round. And the reason they're round is, the only way they could have gotten round is if they were molten at one time. And they have a lot of iron in it. So it's another evidence that we had temperatures higher or high enough to melt steel or iron. Okay? What happens is the surface tension pulls it into a sphere. Once something's liquid, pulls it into a natural sphere. It's not a cube or a pyramid. It's obviously a sphere. Of course, and we also saw molten metal flowing from Tower 2. There it is pouring down there. So there's evidence of high temperatures. It's about 7 minutes before the collapse of Tower 2. All of a sudden it starts pouring out. What is this stuff? Independent scientists started to piece all this evidence together. They had those iron microspheres. They had that molten steel metal coming down. They're trying to come up with what can explain that, because again, this is all after a collapse initiation. It was never explained to us. What could explain that evidence? And Stephen Jones, primarily, and others suggested that, thermite with sulfur in it, would explain that eutectic steel. It would explain those iron microspheres, and it would explain that metal coming down there. So the media picked up on this and sort of the hubbub about this whole idea of thermitic material or thermate, And they respond and say that, no, it couldn't have been thermite because it's not possible for thermite to melt a steel column. The National Geographic used some New Mexico Tech, they conducted an experiment that proved that thermite could not melt a steel column. And since it wouldn't melt a steel column, obviously those crazy truthers must be wrong. And this is what they told us, and they demonstrated by experiment.
If thermite melts through this steel column, the theory of a thermite-controlled demolition may have some validity. While the truthers insist that more explosive super thermite could have been used in the tower demolitions, testing conventional thermite can illuminate this physical process and answer a simple question. Can thermite of any type burn through steel beams? Despite 175 pounds of thermite packed around the steel column, it remained undamaged.
Mythbusters says, the events of 9/11 will not be allowed to be debated and discussed. But they attempted to melt through the roof of a car with half a ton of thermite and couldn't do it. And the debunking websites say, the thermite would have also needed to cut sideways. Not an easy feat for thermite. You see, it's a powder which burns chaotically. Maybe with some device, but no working device has been proven to me to work to cut a vertical column. So we are led to believe that thermitic material cannot melt steel, cut steel horizontally or vertically, and would take massive amounts to do any real damage. I started thinking about this, and again, I'm no chemist. I don't know much about thermite. I'm no explosive expert either. I don't know anything about explosives, really. But I started to look into this whole idea about thermite and thermate and all these different derivatives of thermite. And you go on YouTube and you find out what thermite can do. And I realized that, well, of course thermite can melt steel. They show it melting a railroad track and welding it and things like that. So I started learning more and more. So I started to think that maybe I can do some sort of experiment. Maybe I can conduct an experiment. Let's see if they're right. Let's see if thermitic material can cut steel. They come out and they basically say it can't cut steel. Well, let's see if it can. So then I had to go about figuring out how I can do this. And I just started grabbing some things around the place. I found some steel beams, and I started kind of putting this thing together. And I put a little video out on the thing. Here's the initial setup of my experiment. Using the same beam from my eutectic steel video and another 12-inch beam, I proceeded to make a double-angle welded connection, which I set up on some 8-inch concrete slabs. I could not obtain nanothermite, so I made small quantities of old-fashioned thermate, which is not considered an explosive, with ingredients that are legal and readily available. Thermate is difficult to ignite, and ordinary fuse is not hot enough. But a magnesium strip, which burns white hot, will ignite the thermate giving off heat and white smoke. In addition to giving off heat and white smoke, thermate produces lots of small spheres of iron. These iron spheres are a natural byproduct of thermate and not from any steel, just like those iron spheres found all through the dust. So that's the first thing I learned, is that thermate, those little round spheres, is a natural byproduct of that thermate. Okay, so then I thought, well, how am I going to melt steel? How am I going to hold it against any steel? If it melts steel, it's going to melt whatever I press against it. So I started thinking about fire brick, and I finally decided, well, maybe I will get some roof tile we have in Florida and cut it in half, put the loose thermite in there, wrap it around with some plastic wrap, and then I was thinking, well, how can I hold that against a steel beam? You can't bolt tile to a steel beam, so I decided to use some magnets and a spring tooth. And I thought, well, if I do this, I'll put 5 pounds on each side of this. Surely it'll melt that thing. It'll just take it right apart. Well, unfortunately in life, nature's not that way. Nature really doesn't care who you are. Nature's going to do what it's going to do, and it's going to prove what's true for that particular setup. So here's my first attempt. There's the clay tile. There's 5 pounds here and 5 pounds on the other side. There's some magnets and a spring tooth there. I went up to it and lit this thing, and I thought, well, here we go. I'm going to prove it. And I basically proved that it didn't do a thing, except for, I think it singed my eyebrows. I did prove that. So I learned that get a little bit further away next time I do that, because it gives off a pretty good heat there. So you do learn from everything in life with experiments. But, as they say, if first you don't succeed, I decided to keep on going. I had to scratch my head a while, and I thought, well, that's strange. It didn't do anything. It didn't do what I thought it would do. So I tried again. Now, when you play this video, I'm going to be talking over it, but as I burn through this column, I want you to, if you can catch it in time, you're going to notice some molten metal pouring down as I go through this. It's fast, but if you slow it down, and you can check it out on the video I gave you in the presentation there, it will create molten metal, and that molten metal looks very similar to what's coming out of the South Tower. But the steel did not melt, meaning that perhaps a container could be made out of steel after all. Using an ordinary steel box tube, I had a slot milled along one edge. Welding the bottom and using clamps on the top to hold the powdered thermate in, I bolted it to a steel beam vertically. I called this device my thermitic box cutter. With only 1.5 pounds of thermate, or less than 1/100th of what the National Geographic experts used for their experiment, not only was I able to melt steel, but it also sliced a vertical cut. So I made a slightly larger thermitic box cutter and used 2 3/8 bolts drilled and tapped on one side of the connection. Here's the molten steel coming out. You dripping out? It only took a slight twist to break it completely off. I noticed as the thermate burned, it tended to lose its cutting power, perhaps because it could expand into the area where the box cutter previously burned. So I built a piston-driven box cutter using a compressed car hatch piston. I added sheets of tungsten to minimize the burnout and allow the piston to slide better. I then bolted my contraption to the flange of the column and ignited the white-hot magnesium. It appears that not only can thermate melt steel, but it can also cut vertical columns. So that was my second test. And that one worked a little bit better. Now, in all those 10,000 pages of the NIST report, they do talk about pressure pulses and dust puffs prior to the collapse of those twin towers. A lot of little pulses coming out and a lot of dust puffs coming out, which I think is a very nice way to say that perhaps there were some pre-weakening explosions. But they called them pressure pulses and dust puffs. And so I thought, well, let's see what else we can do with this stuff. I wonder if we can emulate those pressure pulses and dust puffs through experimentation. Rather than using a mechanical piston to maintain volume, I segmented my box cutter with steel plates, hoping to get a more uniform burn, but got some unexpected results. Can thermate make pressure pulses and/or dust puffs? I guess it can. But why waste all that thermate and energy cutting the columns? Why not attack the weakest areas instead? Can thermate cut bolts? I guess it can. But what if just the head of the bolt is exposed rather than the nut and the threads? Can thermate be configured to cut just the bolt head? I guess it can. And without any evidence on the other side. I don't think that something like my piston-driven box cutter was bolted to the office walls, or trash bags full of thermite used. It's more likely that any pre-weakening thermitic material were hidden inside the perimeter box columns. I had a replica of a segment of the WTC box columns made up. And like the Trade Center iron workers, I bolted the segments together and made 2 sets of my 2 bolt blasters, placing them in the access hole. Let's listen to another eyewitness.
Like, it sounded like gunfire. You know, bang, 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 bang. And then all of a sudden, 3 big explosions.
Is it even possible that thermate could do this? I guess it is. I made a 4-sided internal box cutter that was split into 2 pieces so they could be inserted inside the column. Let's see what happens. I think my box cutter blew about 50 feet up, consuming valuable energy and trimming my trees in the process. Nevertheless, the inside of the column was cut about 3/4 of the way through. Were thermitic devices or maybe explosive nanothermite sprayed inside those box columns? I'm not sure. And I'm not sure. I'm just saying what thermite can and cannot do. I'm not sure. But I think thermite can do some damage. Now remember that eutectic steel that I talked about earlier, where they had that Swiss cheese looking things and how the gypsum or drywall didn't seem to produce that Swiss cheese. And how we were told that sulfur emissions from thermite or thermate are shown to be quite small compared to those gypsum sources. So it's very unlikely that it would come from any kind of thermite because there's so much more in gypsum. Remember that steel, it was razor sharp, it was melted, had intergranular melted. Can thermite do anything like that? Can it cause any holes or make it sharp on one edge? Let's find out. And here is less than 4 pounds of thermite focused on the web of a wide flange. Which can also be set up on a vertical column. The web was reduced in thickness with gaping holes, thinned to almost razor sharpness, with a Swiss cheese appearance. So I guess thermite can make steel to have Swiss cheese and have it rather sharp, based on my experiments. So again, remember the National Geographic experts and all the experts out there asked us this question.
Can thermite of any type burn through steel beams?
Using your power of observation, what do you think? Do you think it can, even though the experts said it could not be done? And again, I am certainly no explosive expert whatsoever. I just sort of fumbled through my way on this thing. I didn't know, I had no clue what I was doing, really. And so even though the experts said that it couldn't be done, unfortunately, there's another little quote out there. In these days, when a man who says a thing cannot be done is quite apt to be interrupted by some idiot doing it. And still the websites are out there. There's people out there that talks about thermite. Where's the proof that thermite has ever been used to bring down major buildings and control demolitions, not just cleaning up debris, says the website of Dr. Judy Woods. Dave Thomas, Skeptical Inquirer. Thermite is simply not practical for carrying out a controlled demolition, and there is no documentation of it ever having been used for this purpose. Well, perhaps. But in 1935, Century of Progress, World's Fair, Chicago, Illinois, 2 massive twin towers. These twin towers were larger than Building 7. They were about 628 feet tall. And they carried people back and forth across at that fair there. And they weighed over 3 million pounds apiece. And for whatever reason, when the fair was over, they had to get rid of the towers. How do we get rid of them? Well, one of the twin towers, they put about 125 pounds of dynamite and they blew it and they brought it down. The other twin tower, again, I don't know why, but for whatever reason, they decided to take it down with thermite. And so they made these little beehive structures around the column, about 10, 15 feet apart, lined it with fire brick, 1,500 pounds of thermite, and down it came. So it has been used to take down steel structures. Now, interestingly, there's a lot of debunking books out there, and Popular Mechanics come out with all the debunking, what can and can't be done. They have the latest one out here called Debunking 9/11 Myths. For some reason, it does not mention the sulfur or the eutectic steels. They forgot to mention that. It did not mention the iron microspheres either. It doesn't mention a lot of it doesn't mention the uniform acceleration that we saw. It doesn't mention the collapse of the inner core columns or how that steel was cut. But interestingly, this one thing here, how did we learn about it? Well, it was in Popular Mechanics magazine. We just have to go a little bit further back in history to find it, but it's there. So again, no matter what theory you're told a lot of stuff, in my opinion, a lot of nonsense out there. Whatever theory they're talking about for 9/11, okay? Whether it's the explosions were sonic booms, the NIST expansion theory, directed energy weapons, whatever it may be, tell them to prove it by experiment. Because we know that regardless of how beautiful their theory may appear, if it doesn't agree with experiment, it's wrong. It's wrong. Now, did NIST conduct some experiments? Well, yes, they did. They conducted experiments on floor assemblies, entire floor assemblies, to see if they get that sag. Unfortunately, the results of the NIST experiments did not prove their mathematical model. They also did some steel temperature tests that Kevin Ryan mentioned earlier, and that didn't get the temperatures that they needed that they put into their model. So what do? Well, what you do is you throw out what happens in nature. Since the results from the NIST tests or experiments did not confirm their computer assumptions, you just ignore the test results. And that's what they did. And they didn't do any experiments for World Trade Center 7. So not one official collapse theory to date can be supported by experiment, except one. And it was clear that very first day. It was clear.
I think we're safe. Here I think I'm on safe ground, Bill. I don't think this was clearly the way the structure is collapsing. This was the result of something that was planned. This is not, it's not accidental that the first tower just happened to collapse and then the second tower just happened to collapse in exactly the same way. How they accomplished this, we don't know. But clearly this is what they wanted to accomplish.
Explosions. Explosions are what they told us. Explosions are what we heard. It explains all the evidence. Explosions and incendiaries, a combination of the two perhaps. Because only that theory explains the evidence. It explains the acceleration down of that North Tower with no impact or jolts. It explains those squibs. It explains the collapse of what we call the spire or the inner core columns after the mass of the floors went down. It explains why the Tower 1 first dropped, the antenna on Tower 1 dropped first. It explains those high velocity ejections of the steel. It explains the free fall of Building 7. It explains the energy needed to get that powdered concrete that we saw over Ground Zero. And it explains the cut steel, since we know fires cannot cut steel. It explains the eutectic steel. Thermate will do that. It explains the iron microspheres, a byproduct of thermate. It explains where those came from. It explains that molten metal looks just like molten steel or iron, thermite, perhaps from thermite. That would explain it. And it explains why we actually found evidence in the dust, that'll be talked about later, of thermite, a special kind of thermite, nanothermite, which will be touched on later on. All that evidence put together is the only thing that makes any sense whatsoever. So all the arguments from authority, as Carl Sagan once said, all arguments from authority are unacceptable, unless they can be backed up, I'll add, by experiment. So never forget 9/11. Never forget what they told us that very first day, because what they told us that day is the only thing that makes any sense. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Jonathan Cole. I would love to have grown up as a kid next door to the Cole family. Canada Day or the 4th of July every day of the year, I guess.
We had a good time.
Let us now have questions from our panelists. Professor Johnson.
Thank you very much. When I was a kid, I experimented with magnesium and burned my eyelashes off, so I can relate to your experiments, which are very, very interesting indeed. You talked about the possibility of thermite being embedded in the columns, the exterior columns. And I just wonder how that would be possible in a building that is already constructed. Would that be done after the construction or possibly while it was being constructed. There have been some suggestions that some buildings are pre-wired for demolition in advance.
Right. Yeah, I actually went to school for structural engineering, and I can tell you we never had a course in putting explosives in a building while we're designing it. So I don't subscribe to that theory that it was in there beforehand. Now the question comes up, well, how on earth could they have got that material in there? We know from the physics, from the laws of physics, that's what was done. The question of how it was done is a little bit trickier question, but remember when Kevin Ryan had mentioned that there was an interesting coincidence that where those planes impacted just had insulation upgrades on those floors, coincidentally. Exactly, I believe, in Tower 1 and almost exactly in Tower 2. So when you're putting insulation in, whether it's a spray-on insulation or whatever they use, I think they normally use a spray-on insulation for that, I'm not 100% sure. But when you're rehabbing an existing floor, there's nobody in there. And what do? You take the walls off. You take the drywall off so you can insulate, and plus you can insulate. You take the ceiling tiles out. This is a drop ceiling here. You take those tiles out so you can get in there and insulate it. Is it possible that when those walls were off, is it possible that those handholds which are there to bolt those segments together, is it possible that all those segments would have been exposed during that insulation rehab that was done a few months before the towers came down? I think it's possible. And is it possible, now we talk about the perimeter columns, and again, I don't know. I'm not suggesting it was done on all the columns, but I'm thinking that possibly it was done on those impact floors. Why would it be done on those impact floors? And this is speculation. Let me add, this is speculation. My opinion, why it could have been done on the impact floors, on the plane impact floors, was to pre-weaken it, was to get those things to bow in, was to heat those columns up. That's why we saw possibly that molten metal pouring from the exact same place where the plane hit 7 minutes before. Maybe it was some pre-weakening that was going on there. Now, as far as the core columns, how could you get it in the core columns? Well, we talked about the elevator upgrade. And why would we even use thermite or thermate in the core columns? Speculation on my part. In order to cut steel with those cutter charges, again, I'm not an explosive expert, it can go up to a certain thickness. But what did we have in the core columns all the way down? We had these huge box columns. It was a box, but there was also a center steel reinforcing. It was actually 3 webs going across on that box. Well, how do you cut the inside web there? What about if we were somehow able to fill those box columns up with thermite or thermate or nanothermite? Would that help weaken it? Would that help weaken the structure? Speculation only. Please understand that I'm not testifying to that.
Professor Lee.
I'm intrigued about one thing that you mentioned in passing. Are we to assume that Professor Besant is still a distinguished professor whose reputation is not the least bit affected by him producing what I think the technical term was cockamamie?
I'm sure he is still a distinguished professor. I just wish he would provide, or somebody, you know, we all have different skills in life. Some people are more theoretical and mathematical, the theoretical physicists and the theoretical folks out there, and then there's guys like me who are more hands-on. I just wish somebody could go out there and prove this crush down, crush up. If they do that, well, then that would exonerate Professor Besant. But until that's done, laws of nature say it cannot happen.
But I'm kind of curious that the physics community has, with the exception of David Chandler perhaps, that there hasn't been a flurry of letters to the editor criticizing that. And I don't know if this is something you're in a position to comment on or not.
Well, I think the fundamental issue is that nobody, the average person out there, I didn't know. 3 years ago, I had no clue about this. I didn't know. They don't even know this is all going on right now. They don't know. The average person doesn't understand what's happening out there. They just, you know, they just assume the authorities are taking care of it. Don't worry, it's all been answered. The largest study in the world, it's all been answered. Don't worry about it. You know, pass the ketchup, please. So it just doesn't get on the radar, in my opinion.
It was also intriguing, although you didn't mention it per se, that F. Greening was a co-author with Besant, and then he went out on his own and then, you know, produced a paper in a whole different area. And so you'd love to know what linked the two of them, you know, and what common purpose linked the two of them to tackle.
Seems to be one, doesn't it? I wonder who pays them. I wonder who funds them. Not that it would have anything to do with it, but it's possible that that who employs them may have something to do with it. But yes, there's a common link there. There's no question about it. There's several papers that were written by some scientists to help debunk us guys out here that are showing evidence to the contrary.
Yes, Judge Imposimato.
On 1993, 700 Semtex kilograms planted by Al Qaeda exploded in the parking of World Trade Center, and no remarkable damage happened. So the Twin Towers appeared to be solved. This event can be useful in order to prove that theory of explosion controlled together with the crash airplane, in sense that it appears strange that 700 kilograms, no damage provoked in 1993. In comparison with the demolition of the I think that could have been a argument that support your theory.
Yeah.
7 kilograms of this is necessary. The expert ballistic consultancy, and so we cannot. But I think that 700 kilograms of Semtex are very, very powerful.
Yes, yes, and I think your comment is that in 1993 there was another bombing. I believe they parked a vehicle down below. It was on the outside of those columns there. And yes, it caused quite a bit of damage, but it couldn't bring those towers down, which is sort of testament to how strong those towers were. They were very strong, extremely strong. But the notion that for some reason we can say that a plane hit it, the plane did not cause those to come down. We all agree on that. It was only an office fire that could make those buildings come down, and yet somehow office fires, which burn around 1,800 degrees or 1,000 degrees colder than what's needed to melt steel, everybody's thinking, well, that could do it, but thermite or explosives, which burn over 1,000 degrees hotter to melt steel, couldn't do it somehow. So I think there's a whole bunch of backwards thinking there. But yes, it's my opinion that bomb, and I'm no expert on that, by the way, that bomb was on the outside of a column. I'm thinking now, well, if they could bring down that skyride tower by placing it around the perimeter of the column, why couldn't you place it on the inside of the column and do the same thing? Haven't run an experiment, but it seems to me that thermite would react just as well inside of that column and help bring it down. So I don't know if there's a link between the 93 bombing and the 2001 bombing, but maybe somebody learned something from that. That was their first experiment. I don't know.
Thank you.
Professor Jenkins.
Mr. Cole, I'm still trying to get some sense of how many charges might be involved in bringing the buildings down the way we observed them to come down. We heard earlier today about the sort of karate chop impressions that eyewitnesses had of the series of explosions all the way down the building. And we've heard it from other reports that the steel sections that remained in the debris of the destruction were inconvenient 30-foot sections for being towed away. It suggests to me a great number of charges all the way up and down. Is that plausible, or can it be ruled out as not necessary to have the effects that we see?
It's my opinion that you're correct. It's my opinion. First of all, we absolutely know from the laws of physics as far as the acceleration that David Chandler points out, and he has a lot of other videos, by the way, on Tower 1, and I do an experiment to kind of back that up. But we know from Newton's laws that it happened. It happened. These other questions as far as, well, how much did it take and how could they do it, you have to ask yourself that the laws of physics are impossible to be violated. It's impossible. The other questions, are they impossible or are they only improbable? They are improbable, but they are not impossible. Now, the real question is, well, they were cut up in 30-foot sections. Do I think that maybe they had to put them in there about every 30 feet? My personal opinion is yes, I think they did. I think they put them at the weld points on those core columns. They put cutter charges on them. They got into the elevator, they got the access there, and they got to the external core columns there. And in fact, Gordon Ross is a Scottish engineer. Gordon Ross, he outlines in his presentation in front of the YMCA, I believe it was in July of 2007, he answers those questions about how were the charges placed, where were they placed, and how could it have been done to get the observation that we observed. And his theory is that the S&D, they were planted in those core columns. And they over-designed it. They over-designed those charges so it would really blow outward, which is why it blows outward. And the reason that the corners weren't involved, okay, you notice the corners lag behind, okay? The reason is if you take a rectangle, okay, let's say this is a cross-section of the structure here, and inside you have the 47 core columns, and you load those up with charges. As those are blowing outward, it's natural to miss the corners. And so there were other charges placed on the corners, and they would clip as they come down. It was all sequenced in time, so it would blow out the main floors, powderize all that, and then it would clip the corners in larger segments coming down. Now that's Gordon Ross's theory. It seems to make sense. It may be why we see that molten steel near the corner too. So yes, I think it's possible. I think it's definitely possible.
I'm a little confused on this. I thought earlier you were saying that you thought it would be necessary to get these charges in the perimeter box columns.
Yes,
but then you said that it's possible also that by doing it with the central columns, the force of the ejections would accomplish the rest. So I don't know where I am.
Well, okay. What I said before, I said, and again, this is just a speculation. Please understand this is speculation. What I said before, that it is possible that when they were rehabbing, when they were putting the insulation in the floors where the planes hit, maybe they put thermitic material inside those box columns. The access was there. There was nobody there. If they're doing insulation work, that's when it could have possibly been done. What would that do? That would pre-weaken the exterior columns, so when those planes hit in that area there, it would also give a lot of fire in that area, and it would help pre-weaken it and maybe start the initiation of collapse in that area just by pre-weakening it. As far as the main demolition of the structure, what I'm suggesting is to take a look at the Gordon Ross video. Again, he's speculating also, but he has a lot of evidence to back it up. He's speculating that the core column blew out below that area down below. So it's my opinion that it's a combination of incendiaries and explosives. I don't know how that combination was, but I do know that the effects we see, it explains virtually all the effects that we see.
Final question. Is it your view that less access would be required for Building 7 because of the way it was demolished, or would it be the same kind of problem?
No, it'd be a different kind of problem in my opinion. The Twin Towers were kind of unique in their design. They had those 47 core columns and then the 240 perimeter columns. So it didn't really lend itself to an implosion type thing where the walls fold in. It's so tall, 1,300 and something feet tall. It's so big that it's hard to implode those walls in. Where the Building 7 was more of a conventional design, wide flange columns and beams and things like that. So it's my opinion that Building 7 could have been rigged as a normal, ordinary demolition with, quote, implosions where those walls implode. And the Twin Towers were actually explosions. I mean, they all use explosions, but blowing it outward. And obviously they had plenty of access. If we are to assume that it wasn't Al-Qaeda sneaking around in the CIA place there, they had plenty of time and access to do Building 7, certainly, because that was all government offices in there, so that wouldn't have been a problem.
Yes, we're running low of time, so perhaps if this could be the last question from Professor Johnson.
Over the years, I've been a subscriber to National Geographic, to Popular Mechanics. I even subscribed to the Skeptical Inquirer at one time. And I make contributions to PBS, and I watch Nova. I'm just rather taken aback that these authorities, I guess they would be called authorities, along with the American Society of Civil Engineers, have all lent their prestige to well, attempted refutation of the facts that you have presented us. How can we explain this? Well, I haven't a word for it. I'm going to cancel my subscriptions.
I think one of the things you need to consider is the fact that, and this can be verified. It's my understanding back in the 80s, about 50 corporations owned virtually all mainstream media. And it's my understanding that today, 4 or 5 corporations own all mainstream media. So maybe it's 6. Maybe there's a coalescing of ownership of that, and maybe those owners had something to gain financially from this whole event. So they're using, it's my opinion, that Popular Mechanics, that was bought by the Hearst Corporation, I believe, in 1959. And there's some interesting things there. Actually, if you read Debunking, 9/11 Debunking by David Ray Griffin, he sort of tears apart the whole history of the whole popular mechanics thing. That may be a good read for you. He does a pretty good job dismembering them. So, yes, I agree. I've also done the same thing. I no longer, and that's maybe the one thing to learn here. What can we do about 9/11? I don't know. Maybe one thing we can do is don't support those who don't see it. It's the litmus test. If they don't see 9/11, don't support them anymore. Thank you.